Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Hashomayim, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's Tuesday Night Learning. We have a real treat in store for you. Philippe Sands in conversation with our Cantor Gideon Zelermyer, introduced by McGill Law Professor Shauna Van Praag and thanked by Supreme Court Justice Nicholas Cassirer. What a lineup. And I'm so impressed that Philippe Sands in London is staying up to midnight to give this presentation live. We're so appreciative, and I, like all of you, know this will be a great evening. Feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions. Shauna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My name is Shauna Van Praag. I'm a professor of law at McGill, and it is a true honor this evening to introduce Philippe Sands, a remarkable jurist, prolific and creative writer, and valued colleague in the legal academy. Professor Sands teaches law at University College London, where he is director of the Centre on International Courts and Tribunals. As a barrister and Queen's Counsel, he has argued cases before international tribunals, including the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. His 17 books on international law include East-West Street, On the Origins of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity, published in 2016, and his most recent work, about which we will hear this evening, The Ratline, The Exalted Life and Mysterious Death of a Nazi Fugitive. In an address to a graduating law class a century ago, Justice Benjamin Cardozo said, "A jurist must be historian and prophet all in one." Philippe Sands shows us through his work how we as jurists look to the past in order to participate in building the future. As we will hear, Professor Sands reminds us of the significance of the individual stories that make up history and shape prophecy. He underscores the details of life and law that can record and respond to past atrocities. And he articulates the ideas and commitments and arguments that ground an insistence on and pursuit of justice, always justice. In East-West Street, as many of you know, Philippe Sands paints a picture of Lemberg, also known as Lviv or Lvov, through portraits of individuals associated with the place. He weaves together three individuals, neighbors, and Jews. Leon Buchholz, the author's grandfather, Hirsch Lauterbach, international law scholar responsible for the notion of crimes against humanity, and Raphael Lemkin, international lawyer responsible for introducing the term and notion of genocide. He adds Hans Frank, Hitler's lawyer and Governor General of occupied Poland, and an individual charged, tried, and hanged for the crimes of atrocity observed, experienced, and brought into international law by Lauterbach and Lemkin. If East-West Street invited us to contemplate the complex construction and consequences of justice, then the Ratline pushes us to confront the messy entanglement of love, lies, and extraordinary attempts to avoid and evade justice. I introduced Professor Sands this evening not only as a fellow law professor, a reader of East-West Street, and a follower of the Ratline podcast before it became a book, but as a resident of a street here in Montreal that provides a tiny snapshot of the intersection of local stories and international justice that characterizes Philippe Sands' work. On Avenue Kerb, some of you may know it as Curbs or Kirby's, a north-south street of Montreal, three houses with mezuzahs on the front doors are lined up side by side. I live in the middle one. To my right is the house where Rabbi Pinchas Hirschsprung and his wife Chaya raised a family of 9 children. Acknowledged as a Gadol Hador, a Jewish great one of his generation, Rav Hirschsprung came from the village of Dukla in the eastern Polish region of Galicia. In 1939, as a young rabbi, he began a long journey east, away from Nazi occupation, a journey that took him to Lemberg, the city of East-West Street. Despite his mother's appeal to stay with his uncle in Lemberg, Rav Hirschsprung kept going. He reached Vilnius in Lithuania, where he was one of the lucky recipients of an exit visa to Japan issued by Consul General Chiune Sugihara. And from Japan, he came to Canada, first to Vancouver, and then here to Montreal. To my left is the house where Abraham Moses Klein and his family lived. A.M. Klein is one of the great Montreal poets in the English language. He worked as a lawyer, but he is acclaimed for his creative writing rooted in the traditions of Judaism and at the same time compelled by the freedom of international modernism. In the Hitleriad, he wrote, "Happier would I be with other themes, who rallies nightmares when he could have dreams." A.M. Klein could be called the Jewish grandfather of Canadian poetry. At the same time, he was the literal grandfather of Alana Klein, my colleague and a law professor of criminal law and justice, like Professor Sands, here at McGill. As we will hear, Philippe Sands encourages us to see and share these kinds of connections of people, places, and paths, of past, present, and future, of individuals, identities, and intergenerational stories. He listens to voices, he records narratives, he traces links, he enriches knowledge, and he inspires advocacy and action. Professor Sands has shared his ideas with students around the world, from Paris to Geneva, Boston to New York, Melbourne to Lviv. Tonight, he visits Congregation Hashomayim in Montreal with warmth and anticipation. We welcome him in dialogue with Cantor Gideon Zelermyer.
What a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much, Professor. And Professor, lovely to have you with us this evening.
Well, Cantor, it's great to be back with you. We know each other well, as the audience is about to discover. I do just want to thank Shauna for that extraordinarily thoughtful and interesting introduction, from which I learned things. It's always exciting when you listen and you learn about streets and who lives there. And I've noted the names, and I'm going to be doing a little bit of digging in due course. But
maybe it'll lead to another book. We never know. So yes, connections are a major theme of this evening, and drawing out the connections between different people, their family stories, the stories of history, and where travels, war, tragedy, and love has taken them. And so tell us a little bit about how we got here. We did get a bit of introduction about some of the themes of East-West Street, but is it fair to say that it grew out of that the Ratline grew out of East-West Street?
It did, and I will be happy to give you the very short version of that. I hope at some point, Gideon, we will be able to weave in the visit to McGill and to Montreal, which of course plays a role. We'll come back to that in due course, but let's just park that idea and come back to how it all began. You know, I as Shauna said, I teach at the university. I do cases as a barrister. Out of the blue, in the spring of 2010, I received an invitation to give a lecture on the cases I have done before international courts and tribunals on crimes against humanity, the destruction of individuals, and genocide, the destruction of groups. The invitation came from an obscure university, as I thought, in an obscure city in Ukraine called Lviv. And it asked whether I would come and visit and give a talk. And I quickly worked out that Lviv was Lemberg, and Lemberg was where my grandfather was born in 1904. And so I accepted, because I wanted to visit the city of birth of my grandfather, who had left in 1914 for Vienna, and then was expelled from Vienna because he was Jewish, and went to Paris, and his one-year-old child, my mother, joined him a few months later and survived the Nazi occupation of Paris in hiding. And I went to Lemberg because I wanted to find the house where my grandfather was born, which I did. It was a matter of identity. I wanted to know more about who he was. He'd never talked about this period to me. And it was a way of knowing who I was, and we can come back to that. And in the course of the research of the summer before I went to Lviv, I discovered extraordinarily, and by accident, I wasn't looking for it, that the man who invented the concept of crimes against humanity in international law, put it in the Nuremberg Statute, Lauterbach, was from Lviv, had been to the law school, that had invited me, and they didn't know that. And then remarkably,
Sorry, they didn't know that?
No, I arrived. Wow. I mean, well, first I'd worked out that Hersch Lauterbach came from Lviv and went to that law school. And I thought, well, that'll be interesting. I'll share that when I arrive. And then I discovered, unbelievably, that Raphael Lemkin had also been to the law school, and they didn't know that either. So I arrived with this remarkable information that modern international criminal law's roots may be traced not only to this region, not only to this city, but to this very law school. And I eventually found the classroom where they had been taught by Professor Makarevich.
Amazing. And to the very street that they both grew up on, as well as your grandfather.
Well, they didn't both grow up on it, but I did learn eventually that Hersch Lauterbach was born, in fact, about 25 kilometers from Lviv in a small town that was called Zhulkiev, today Zhovkva. And I then discovered, having found out about my grandfather's past, that his mother, who I never met, my beloved unknown great-grandmother, Amalia Flaschner Buchholz, was also born in the same town of Zhulkiev, and even more remarkably, on the very same street as Hersch Lauterbach, Lemberger Strasse, which the great writer Joseph Roth called East-West Street. And this was personally, for me, very remarkable, because my first teacher of international law was Elie Lauterbach, the only child of Hersch Lauterbach. And I knew Elie from 1982, I think, and it was only in 2015 that I shared with him this extraordinary coincidence that we could trace our roots to the very same street. Elie was my mentor. Elie got me my first teaching job at Cambridge University. You literally couldn't invent it.
That's a lot of Beshert happening in one place.
Yeah.
So East-West Street, the history of these two men, as well as your grandfather, as well as one other major player who is the demonic villain in the story. Tell us about him.
Well, I come back from Lviv, and I'm a bit excited. These three characters, my grandfather, Lauterbach, Lemkin, it's Leon Lauterbach, Lemkin, Lemberg, Lvov, Lviv, it's L. I mean, again, it was pretty weird.
Lots of alliteration.
Yeah. So I started doing research, and I started writing a book that I thought would be about three men. And then I came across a fourth character, not a decent person, Hans Frank, who had been Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928 to 1933, and was then rewarded with the Ministry of Justice in Bavaria initially, and then in 1939, Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland. And he eventually is tried at the famous Nuremberg trial, defendant number 7. You'll know him from the photographs. He's often wearing dark glasses. And he is indicted for the murder of 4 million human beings. I mean, it beggars belief, 3 million Jews and 1 million Poles, amongst them my grandfather's entire family that remained in Lviv and Zhulkiev, Lauterbach's family, and Lemkin's family. And so he became the glue, if you like, the connector. What was even more remarkable was that Lauterbach and Lemkin were prosecutors at Nuremberg, Lauterbach for the British, Lemkin for the Americans, Lauterbach for crimes against humanity, Lemkin for genocide. What they didn't know when the trial opened on the 20th of November 1946 was that the man they were prosecuting was responsible for the deaths of their own families. And as someone who litigates in courts, this touched me very deeply. It's very hard to imagine that.
And these two concepts didn't initially fit together quite neatly, did they?
No, I mean, Lauterbach and Lemkin, who remarkably never met, although I've traced them to the same town and even the same building, actually, but it seems they never talked to each other. The two ideas operated separately. And again, it becomes, in a sense, almost more, what connects us is our fascination in language, Gideon, and words and interpretation. It's almost sort of biblical or Talmudic in its connection between the law. We have another personal point of connection, maybe we'll come to that. How one interprets words. Lauterbach's thesis was that the two men shared the idea that we need to harness the power of law, of international law, to protect human beings. But how? And they had two different theories. Lauterbach's theory was that we must protect all human beings as individuals, as sentient human beings who have minimum rights precisely because they are human beings. Lemkin said, no, that's not going to work. People don't get targeted, killed, abused, mistreated because of what they have done. They get targeted and abused and killed because of who they are, a member of a group that is hated in time and in place. And so the law must reflect that. And so Lemkin's idea was to protect not the individual, but groups, and in that way protect human beings. So the end objective was the same, but they got there in different ways. Lauterbach, for the rest of his life, was totally opposed to the concept of genocide. He worried, I think with some justification, that it would replace the tyranny of the state, as he put it, with the tyranny of the group.
And so you have so many convergences of so many different ideas and different people. How was this book received?
Well, just a point of connection between us, because I have had the great happiness of listening to your music.
You're itching. I know you're itching.
Well, no, I just want to begin to introduce the note of music.
I'm holding that for a bit later, but go ahead.
Yeah. But I'm not going to talk about that subject.
Okay, very well.
Okay, what I'm going to tell you is about a piece of music, Bach's Matthäus Passion. Okay, so in the course of the research, I come across a letter that Lauterbach, who's prosecuting Frank at Nuremberg, writes to his son Eli, who's living in the States at the time, and says, look, I've just learned the entire family has perished. They've been killed by the man that I'm prosecuting. This is a terrible time. I get through the day, he writes to his son, by listening to Johann Sebastian Bach, and in particular, the Matthäus Passion, the Matthew Passion. I then discover that at the very same time, the man he is prosecuting, Hans Frank, tells the US Army psychologist who is attending to his psychological needs because he's in difficulty, that he gets through the day by imagining that he's listening to music. And he says, I'm listening to the music of Bach and the Matthew Passion.
Oh my goodness.
So that struck me as remarkable. So I deep dive into the Matthew Passion. And of course, you will know the Matthew Passion better than I, but I discover that the Matthew Passion isn't.
Sadly, I don't think I'll ever sing it in my career, but
well, I will learn how to sing it and we'll sing it together one day. But
deal.
The Matthew Passion is extraordinary. It's the same themes as Lauterbach and Lemkin. The Matthew Passion, music by Johann Sebastian Bach, has a libretto which celebrates pietism, the idea of, if you like, of an anti-Catholic belief. And the music of the Matthew Passion posits the direct relationship between the individual and his or her God, the bypassing of the priest celebrant, the community, the group, the organization. In other words, the Matthäus Passion, and Lauterbach understood this, was essentially celebrating the role of the individual and the individual's direct relation with God, something that Lemkin did not support with his idea of genocide. So there is a direct parallel. How was it received? Consternation. I wrote this book, as I thought I wrote most of my books, for 3,000 or 4,000 people. We're now, I think, approaching 30 languages and 500,000 copies. It's pretty wild. And the thing that makes me happiest, because I do have an agenda, my agenda is in relation to the global settlement of 1945, the United Nations, the idea of rights for individuals and groups, the idea that the sovereign's powers are not unlimited. And I feel very protective of that fragile 1945 settlement. And my project is to reach ordinary folk, non-lawyers, and explain why this is so important. And that has made me extremely happy, I have to say, that the readers, there aren't 500,000 international lawyers in the world. And the fact that the readership, including many people of this community, many people watching this, are interested in these issues is enormously satisfying.
Well, I think it sort of behooves us as people who have been frequently persecuted to know a little bit of the mechanics of what is there to protect us and does it work or not. And certainly, as you have these two men working on the Nuremberg trials, of course, you have the defendants who are saying, well, we're just part of a big group. What are you blaming us individually for? It's not our fault as individuals. We don't bear that responsibility. And that sort of cuts to what I think is the core theme of at least one of the major players of the Ratline, which is the idea of responsibility and culpability and the role that a person plays in this big Nazi machine. So where do we go? How do we bridge from East West Street to the Ratline? Is that for Nick?
We bridge it in the following way. I come to know Hans Frank's son, Nicholas, who's a fairly remarkable individual. And we become actually very close. We're very close now. It's a curious thing, but we are. And one day in late 2011, Nicholas says to me, Philippe, you're from Lemberg. Your grandfather was from Lviv. The governor based in Lviv was my father's deputy, Otto Wächter. Yes, I said, I know the name. I know nothing about him. Would you like to meet his son? I know him. He said, unlike me, who despises my father, you need to understand, and the viewers this evening, that the first time I met Nicholas Frank, he said to me, Philippe, you have to understand, I am against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father. He despises his father, who he treated as a mass murdering criminal. But he said, you'll see, Horst Wächter, the son of Otto Wächter, takes a different view. Otto Wächter, like Frank, was indicted for mass murder, crimes against humanity and genocide, but was never caught. And the son Horst looks for the good in his father. He is not a Holocaust denier. He is not an anti-Semite, but he says, to honor my mother, who I love, and she loved my father, I must try to find the good in my father. So I met Horst. One thing led to another. I wrote a profile of him for the Financial Times magazine. That led to the making of a BBC documentary, My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did, which
people must watch, because I watched it subsequent to reading the Ratline, and all of a sudden so many episodes in the book came to life in full color for me.
Right.
And
like when we're running around a field in Ukraine with hundreds of people dressed in Waffen SS uniforms.
Yeah, we'll get to that. That to me is really the
most. That was very key. We had a shocking day near a town called Brody, which was actually where Joseph Roth was born, where there is an extraordinary, completely preserved 15th, 16th century Jewish cemetery, an extraordinary place. We went there, and the following day I did an interview with Nicholas Frank, which was filmed, and Nicholas was very upset with the previous day with all these Waffen SS people, and he was very upset with Horst, who'd had a lovely day because everyone was telling him how great his dad was. And Nicholas said on camera, I think that Horst is a new kind of Nazi. I disagreed with that. I said, he's not. He's a damaged person. I don't like what he says, but I don't think he's a Nazi, and I don't think he's an anti-Semite, which Nicholas now agrees with. But he said it. It made its way into the film, and Horst was extremely upset when he saw it. And he asked me, what can I do, Philippe, to prove that I'm not a Nazi? And I said, well, you don't have to prove it to me. I know you're not. He said, but no, I want to prove that I'm not a Nazi. The lawyers in the group will know, and maybe also the Cantor will know, that proving a negative is not an easy thing to do. So I had to reflect a little. How does one prove that one is not a Nazi? And by now, in my many conversations and visits with Horst, I had learned that his mother had gathered in a remarkable private archive. She, Charlotte, met Otto in 1929. Otto dies in mysterious circumstances in 1949. And Charlotte keeps 20 years of diaries, letters, photos, family scraps, documents, everything, 10,000 pages. And so I say to Horst, well,
while you're saying this, I'm going to show everyone this family photo.
Yeah, well, this was one of the photos that was in it. And this is 1944. You can see Horst as the little boy on the left, his sister Traute. I'll say a little more about Traute in a minute because you get a sense of these characters. Otto Wächter in the uniform, I mean, not just anyone, one notch below his mentor, Heinrich Himmler. Okay, this is a top table National Socialist. And then Charlotte, his wife, that photograph taken in 1944, I say to Horst, you've got these family albums. Why don't you give them to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.? Nazis don't tend to give family archives like this to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. He says, that's a terrific idea. Will you make an introduction? I make the introduction. I've got people I've worked with there who've been wonderful. And then he says, would you like a copy? And I say, sure, why not? 2 weeks later, I get a, well, I've got it in my desk here, a USB stick. Okay,
That's everything right there.
That's it. That's everything. That's the entire thing. Okay, a single USB stick. And I put it in my computer.
All of the source material of Ratline can be
everything
distilled into that. Yes.
I mean, Horst is an ecologist, so it comes in a very tatty brown used envelope, comes through my letterbox. I put it in my machine, and I'm stunned by what I see. The photographs, obviously, the audio recordings of Charlotte describing the wonders of her mass murdering husband, but the letters, the diaries, but they're all in German. And, you know, they linger in my computer for a few months. And then one day we have a dinner party, as life often happens in this way. And a wonderful person.
Back when we all had dinner parties.
Yeah. Yes, well, they're back. They're back with a vengeance in London. Lisa Jardine, who's a renowned historian, the daughter of the historian Jacob Bronowski, The Ascent of Man. Some of you will remember that TV series.
Very well.
She is a scholar of archival material. And she gets very excited. And she says, oh, you've got to go into this material. And with PhD students and doctoral students and LLM students, we started, it took 4 years, and we deciphered and we uncovered the story of what Otto Wächter did before the war, and even more interestingly, what happened after the war. So I have Horst to thank. I should say he's not entirely thrilled with the book. He wasn't entirely thrilled with the film or the podcast or the article in the Financial Times, but he keeps coming back, although right now he's not thrilled, it has to be said.
So Otto Wächter is a person who all through his life and career found himself right at the focus of the action, starting in the 1930s.
Well, I mean, just a few little hints of the delights of Otto Wächter, Austrian. Even earlier, in 1919, I went to Vienna and celebrated or marked the arrival of Otto Wächter into the University of Vienna Law School in the fall of 1919. Guess what? He enters on the same time as Hirsch Lauterbach, whose family he will later kill. Lauterbach, a student there at the same time as Otto Wächter. Wächter immediately joins the National Socialist Party in Austria, goes up the greasy pole, becomes a lawyer. In 1934, leads the assassination of Engelbert Dollfuss, the Chancellor of Austria, flees. It's a coup attempt. It's their sort of January the 6th effort. Flees to Berlin, joins the SS, joins the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD of the SS, absolutely full of lawyers, comes into the orbit of such characters as Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, Heinrich Himmler, Karl Haas, and others. And on the 15th of March, 1938, returns to Vienna after the Anschluss and stands on the balcony with Adolf Hitler and is appointed, gets his first proper job. He's appointed state secretary, and his job is to remove all Jews from public office. And 16,500 human beings lose their positions, everything from postal workers to chief justices, prosecutors, and his own professors at the University of Vienna Law School. He personally writes to them and removes them from their positions and banishes them to Dachau and Buchenwald. As a university teacher, the idea that I have students in my class who could do that to me concentrates the mind, Gideon. And
as a bar mitzvah teacher, I think about it sometimes too.
Well, he does his job so well that he becomes governor of Krakow, the famous Krakow. He is the one who comes up with the idea of the ghetto, the marking of the Jews, the rounding up of the Jews. And he does that job so well that when time comes to implement the final solution, he is sent to Lemberg in February 1942 to do the necessary work. And of course, in the letters, in the private correspondence, it's always private correspondence that's more revealing, if you like, than the public documents. We find references. August 1942, my darling Charlotte, I'm away from Lemberg, I'm in Krakow. The great Judenaktion has begun, the evacuations, quote unquote, mass murder, exterminations.
Right.
She knew all about it. He was deeply implicated. It's very distressing reading.
It is, and it's referred to so matter-of-factly.
Well, that's my style of writing, because I think it comes from my being a courtroom litigator. The golden rule:
Dispassionate and
strip
just the facts,
the
man.
emotion out of your advocacy. The judges have no interest in your personal views. They don't want emotional pleadings. And one of the things that I've learned in court, and we'll be hearing from lawyers and judges in due course, but one of the things I have learned is that judges, good judges, tend not to like it when you tell them what they should do. Rather, as an advocate, the better advocates, I think, lay out the material in a way the judges are encouraged to reach a conclusion which is consistent with the one you would like them to reach. And that's what I've done in the style of writing. I don't say what people should think. It is for each person as an intelligent reader to form their own view. So my job is to lay out the material. But of course, in the manner of laying out the material, you push, you tweak, you cajole, you encourage certain views. But I hope it's done quite subtly.
I think it is, and it really lays out, first of all, the lives and the dynamic between these two, which was, I mean, I don't know how typical it was of husbands and wives at the time. There were the aspects of being social climbers, the aspects of intermittent bouts of infidelity and the stresses that caused, lots of pregnancies, lots of children, and
less children than pregnancies.
Yes, and then
and the love of art.
And the love of art and the love of music.
How wonderful it would be to be married to someone who can write out, "This is my wife. Please give her every object from the museum so that she can hang them up in our house." Can you imagine that power? I mean, it is a
that was really something to read. That she just waltzed through the aisles of the museum as though she was in your local grocery store.
I'll have that. Staggering.
At least she had good taste.
She did have good taste, but this is, I think, the $64 billion question. These are highly intelligent individuals. They are highly cultured. They are religious. They are believers. How do such people cross the line into horror? How do they become participants? Because she's a participant too. She knew everything. She encouraged her husband. After the Anschluss, after standing on the balcony with Hitler, they go inside, they come down the big staircase. At the bottom of the staircase, Otto says to Charlotte, "So, my darling, my Hümmchen, I've got a choice. I can go back to a lucrative practice as a lawyer, or I can accept a job in government. What would you like me to do?" "Government," she says. "I want the Mercedes, I want the houses, I want the power." I mean, you mentioned the ambition, and we get an insight of how it begins to happen.
So as we progress through the different actions in the course of the war and the impressions that they write to each other back and forth of the various historical events that are happening around them. So we get to the end of the war and it's not going well. And maybe take us through the end of the war and what happens to these two.
Well, the letters are fascinating and appalling. Charlotte writes to Otto. I mean, they're in real difficulty now. The Red Army's coming and the Americans are coming. She writes to him, for example, this is the kind of idea she comes up with. She has ideas. She's just listened to the Führer on the radio. And she writes to Otto and says, I mean, one thing that needs to be said very clearly, these are deeply anti-Semitic individuals, okay, very overt about it. She writes to Otto and says, I've had an idea. Why don't you persuade the Führer to cut a deal with the British and turn against the Soviets? The British don't like the Soviets. She spent time in London in the 30s. She knows the sort of British style of nationalism. She's rather in favor of empire and colonies. And why don't you why don't you persuade the British to join us in the struggle against the Bolsheviks? No, of course, I know why that's never going to happen. The Jews, they're everywhere, corrupting everything, destroying everything, always. Even right at the end of the war, this is 45, the spring of 45, the anti-Semitism's at the fore. They just can't let go.
Yeah. And so
he calls her on the 8th of May, day before the end of the war, and says it's over. Destroy all my official papers. Their son, Otto Jr., dumps them into Lake Zell in Austria, and Otto disappears off the face of the earth. And in my engagements with Horst, they're basically divided into two periods. Up to 2015, 2016, where I'm basically only interested in what his parents did during the war. What was their complicity? What was their role? What horrors were they engaged in? Then I get this material, and there's a bundle of stuff, thousands of pages, after 1945, from the 9th of May 1945 to the 13th of July 1949, when Wächter dies in a Vatican-run hospital in Rome. And what we have in this material is a detailed account of how a Nazi on the run, trying to get to Argentina on the Ratline, which is what the escape route was called, how someone goes about doing that. It is unbelievable material. It's jaw-dropping. I found it jaw-dropping, to give you an
absolutely example. And there are two sort of competing interests there. On the one hand, you have the Vatican, the church, and in particular one person who is known for facilitating these escapes. Tell us about him.
Well, just before we come to him, maybe just do it sequentially. I just want to spend a moment and describe one particular aspect. Wächter hid for 3.5 years, very close to Salzburg, in the mountains. And in the materials, I discover references in Charlotte's notes of a young Waffen-SS soldier called Burkhard Ratline, who Wächter, it turned out, her husband was hiding with in the mountains. And at a certain point, I say we're December 2016, and I say, so we're 70 years after the end of the war. I say to Horst, tell me about this Burkhard Ratline. What was he like? Why did he help your father? What happened to him after all of this was all over? And Horst looks at me, smiles his beatific, friendly smile, and says, well, Philippe, I can answer all of your questions about Burkhard Ratline, or we could telephone him. Okay, so this is 71 years after the end of the war, 71 years after Ratline and Wächter have gone off to hide in the mountains. Wächter is with a young soldier who is a mountaineer, a mountain killer of partisans and Jews and communists and resistors and political opponents in Yugoslavia and Italy. We could call him, and we do call him, and then we go to visit him. And what a remarkable thing that was, to be with a 94-year-old who can tell you what happened on the escape route and how it was to hide. That was astonishing.
And how Horst, Otto and Charlotte had, for lack of a better word, conjugal visits during the course of his hiding.
Well, this is what's very difficult. I mean, I'm not a fan of Charlotte's. I think you've probably worked that out, and the readers see that pretty quickly. On the other hand, there is something extraordinary about the spouse who every 2 weeks for 3.5 years will make an incredibly arduous trip, about 40 kilometers on the valley bottom, then up, climbing by foot, up to 2,500 meters, where they're hiding in huts in the mountains with provisions, food, clothing, newspapers.
I love how he asks for his favorite overcoats and his
favorite overcoats, the newspapers. He wants the sports pages, and he wants the pages to follow the Nuremberg trial, because all of his mates are being, prosecuted. One of them is Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who is Wächter's best friend and is actually Horst's godfather. To this day, Horst sleeps with a photograph of Arthur Seyss-Inquart, his godfather, next to his bed, even though Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who was the governor of Nazi-occupied Holland, I mean, the book was a bestseller in the Netherlands.
He's the one who's responsible for the death of my Dutch relatives.
Right. He is the one responsible. He is personally responsible.
Who also signed his copy of Mein Kampf, did he not?
To Horst, and I found
Yes.
it. I mean, I just put my hand into the bookshelf, picked out a book, and it was Mein Kampf. Actually, it was the one signed by Charlotte. I mean, these are just terrible people. And what I wanted to get to the root of was how the networks operated, and that I laid out. And then after 3.5 years, Wächter comes down from the mountain, and he heads to Rome, he has by now a new identity. He's become Alfredo Reinhardt, and he's hoping to get a boat from Genoa to Argentina and a new life.
So where is his accommodation in Rome?
The Vigna Pia Monastery, which I go and visit, because it comes from the cases that I do. I always feel it's very important to make site visits. You have to go to the source of the horror or the source of the environmental dispute. You have to get a feel for the river, for the mass grave, it opens the imagination.
Here's Alfredo Reinhardt.
Yeah, so here's Alfredo Reinhardt. This is actually a photograph of Otto in a fake identity card issued to one Alfredo Reinhardt. Now, as you know, you've read the book, Gideon, there's a real Alfredo Reinhardt, who was also another SS soldier or officer who actually built the Eagle's Lair, the Berchtesgaden, where Hitler liked to hang out in the mountains. And I wrote about him in the Ratline, and the book just came out in Argentina like 2 months ago. And a month ago, I got a letter that began, "Dear Mr. Sands, I am the granddaughter of the real Alfredo Reinhardt. You would not believe the correspondence that I get, quite a lot from Canada, actually, because one of the point of connection for our Canadian audience, Otto Wächter was the founder in the spring of 1943 of the Waffen-SS Galicia division, the Ukrainian division, founded with the support of Heinrich Himmler, the first SS division for foreigners. Now, when this division was roundly beaten by the Red Army at the Battle of Brody, and they were imprisoned by the Soviets just wanted to kill them all, shoot them, line them up and shoot them. But the British intervened to stop this from happening and got them released from Soviet incarceration. And you'll be delighted to know that most of them ended up in Canada. And you will also be delighted to know that in various Canadian cities, there are monuments to the Ukrainian Galicia Waffen-SS division put up by descendants of these fine folk. This surprised me, I have to confess. But a number of these monuments exist, and it's the same Galicia division. I mean, they don't put on the monument Waffen-SS, they put Ukrainian Galicia division.
Uh-huh.
And it's the same
thing. The gentrification of the...
It's the same thing. And
wow.
These monuments are up in 2 or 3 places in Canada where the descendants of this community exist. So it's very real. I've had some exchanges with certain people. There is a big Ukrainian population in Canada. I've had some very interesting correspondence about that.
So he goes to Rome, into this particular monastery, and he's taken in by...
Well, here the detective work begins, because the Wächters knew they were being monitored by the British and the Americans. So they knew their letters were being read. So they put everything in code. And this was what Lisa Jardine, the historian, loved, was the police work, working out the secret messages. So, for example, the 29th of April, 1949, Wächter arrives in Rome, where he is met by, quote, the religious gentleman, unquote, but there is no name. And so we have to work out who the religious gentleman is. The religious gentleman is Alois Hudal, the Austrian bishop who runs a place called the Anima Institute and the Instituto Teutonico, the Teutonic Institute. He has been very close to Cardinal Pacelli, who will become Pius XII, but they separate. They're less close after 38, 39, because Hudal is dead keen on a close alliance between the Vatican and the National Socialists, which Pius XII, interestingly, is not quite so keen on. So there's a distancing. But Alois Hudal takes Wächter under his wing, along with various others, names that are familiar: Joseph Mengele, Karl Priebke, Karl Haas, Erich Priebke, Karl Haas, Adolf Eichmann passed in his vicinity, all escaped along the Ratline. And I had the great privilege of working with some extraordinary historians in the United States. People on this webcast now may have read some works by the wonderful historian at Brown University, David Kurtzer, who helped me with the Italian scene between 45 and 49. But I worked with another wonderful professor down in Florida, Professor Norman Goder, who is the main expert in the US on, should we say, National Socialist connections with the United States after the war. And it was Norm Goder who introduced me to the archives of the US Counterintelligence Corps. And in particular, he introduced me to a document entitled Project Los Angeles. And from this document, I learned, unbelievably, that Bishop Alois Hudal, Nazi to the core, was recruited in 1947 as a spy, as a source, as they called it, for the Americans, to report on the movements of Nazis that could be recruited in the new struggle, the Cold War struggle, against the dreaded Soviets. This really surprised me, stunned me, actually. And I went deeper and deeper into it. Hudal was paid $50 a month in cash for 4 years, from 47 to 51. I was so stunned that I went to see my neighbor, unfortunately no longer with us, the great, I don't know about espionage, I don't know about the Cold War, but my neighbor did. He was the writer John le Carre, and a very good friend. And I went to see him, and he stunned me again. I'm stunned quite often on these things. It's remarkable, Philippe, I was there in 49, 50. I said, what do you mean you were there? He said, well, I was a young British soldier, and my job was to question, to interrogate Nazis in German prisoner of war camps. And rather innocently, I said, what? To prosecute them? He said, no, this was what was so perplexing, to recruit them.
Wow.
That was, as he put it, turning on a sixpence. A real shock to him, who, as he said, had been taught that Nazis were the worst of the worst while he was growing up. And now they were our friends against the Soviets.
Since the Soviets, the focus shifted that quickly.
Yeah.
So a couple of things I'd like you to talk about. One is, of course, the let's say the controversy or the varying accounts of Otto's eventual demise. Was he poisoned?
Well, there are two theories. Horst is attached to the idea that his beloved father was poisoned either by the Americans or the Poles or the Soviets or the Jews, anyone, in fact. And he even has a theory for why Simon Wiesenthal personally poisoned his father. Well, anyway, there's no evidence at all for any of that. There is considerable evidence for the second thesis, which is supported by medical evidence. I talked to a lot of very serious medics, that Otto was a very fine swimmer. He loved swimming. He loved rivers. He was a great rower also. And he most likely, I think, picked up a disease called leptospirosis, poisoned rats.
My dog is vaccinated against it every year.
Right. So you understand. And in 49, you got leptospirosis, pre-penicillin and other things. It was pretty serious, and it killed a lot of people. And I think the dominant theory, I leave it a little bit open, but my view for the reader is I think it's leptospirosis. Then 6 weeks ago, I receive a letter from Jerusalem. Dear Mr. Sands, I mean, the correspondence is extraordinary.
This is new.
This is new. You don't know about this. I'm springing this on you. Dear Mr. Sands, my name is X. I'd like to introduce you to my late father-in-law, who passed away only in 2019. His name was Sergio Minerbi. He was born in Rome in 1925. When the Germans occupied Rome, he was taken in by a monastery and hidden, protected by some priests. After the war in 1945, he emigrated with his mother Fanny from Warsaw to Israel, or Palestine as it then was. After Israel got independence, he joined what became Mossad. In the summer of 1948, he returned to Italy, fluent Italian, and he returned to Rome as a member of a four-man, quote-unquote, hit squad.
Oh, my goodness.
His job, Sergio Minerbi's job, was to track Alois Hudal, the dreaded bishop. And Sergio Minerbi returns back to Israel in August 1949, 2 weeks after the death of Otto Wächter. Now, Minerbi, by this point, he writes a memoir. So I've got all of this in black and white. He wrote a memoir. This isn't, this is his own memoir. So he writes all this, but he's now in his 90s. He's sort of forgotten exactly what they did. So he applies for permission to enter the Mossad Israeli archive to see his own records, and permission is refused. Now, right now, I'm engaged in an interesting exchange with a gentleman who wrote a very complimentary review of East-West Street in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz when it came out. He actually wrote it for the English version in 2016, 2017. The writer of one of the most complimentary reviews of East-West Street signs off on his emails to me or his WhatsApps, Bougie. His name is Bougie Herzog, and he's now the president of Israel. So I am engaged in an effort to persuade the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, to reopen Sergio Minerbi's archive. I suspect I've got no chance of success,
Probably
but it's worth having a go.
My goodness.
I know. And it goes on and on. It goes on and on.
Well, this whole cloud around, Otto Wächter was interred no less than 5 times, no?
He dies on the 13th of July, 1949. He's buried on the 16th of July, 1949 in the Central Cemetery, Verano, in Rome. I've been there to find the place. In the papers that Horst gives me, there is some information. It describes Charlotte receiving a phone call from Alois Hudal in 1960 saying, "Oh, Frau Baroness Wächter, I forgot to tell you that as your husband was dying in my arms, he told me he wanted to be buried in the homeland. And so you should come and get him." So she applies for permission to exhume the corpse of her late husband and take it back to Austria. Permission is partly granted and partly refused. She's given permission to exhume, but not to take the body out of Italy to Austria. So she decides to exhume, and she gets permission to take the corpse to Palermo, where one of her many children has married an Italian and is living in Sicily. She drives down to Rome in her big green car, and the body's exhumed, placed in the car, and that's the end of the trail. And I say to Horst, well, what happened next? And Horst has his little smile, and he said, oh, you want to know what happened to Father? I say, yeah, I'd like to know what happened to Father. He says, Mother decided to take him home. I said, what do you mean Mother decided to take him home? She said she went to get him. She put him in the car and he was driven back to Austria. Well, what happened then? Well, she buried him. Well, where did she bury him? Well, there wasn't a place to bury him, so she put him in the garden of the house, the Pension, House Wartenberg, still a hotel today in Salzburg. I've had she buried him in the garden. I put this in the book. I've had about a dozen former student pupils who lived in House Wartenberg writing that they had no idea that Otto was buried there. So
This is while Charlotte was running an English language school, no?
She's running an English language school. Horst's role is to stand outside the school and attract young ladies. He's a good-looking guy. He said, I was quite successful in attracting pupils. They would come and stay for a year. They'd come to know the Baroness. She would take them to the opera and look after them. They knew nothing about her past. They thought she was a peculiar lady, but, you know. And so I said to Horst, is he still there? Is he still at House Wartenberg? He says, no. I said, well, where is he? She said, mother moved. I said, well, where did she move to? She moved to a small town called Fieberbrunn. I said, well, what did she do with him then? She said she buried him in the garden of her house in Fieberbrunn. And is that where he is now? No. Well, where is he now? Well, after 10 years there, he decided he needed a proper burial, so she got in touch with the priest. And the priest found a slot in the cemetery at Fieberbrunn. And so he's in that slot now. No. By now he's been buried 4 times. She ordered that when she died, his coffin was to be placed on top of hers. So he now rests in the cemetery at Fieberbrunn. Interestingly, a month ago, I got an invitation from the book club of Fieberbrunn. Would I come and do a book event like we're doing here in Fieberbrunn, because the town is in a state of slight shock, having discovered who are the residents of the cemetery. They had no idea about any of this. So I'm going on the 10th of January to Fieberbrunn to do a literary and cultural book talk on Die Ratline and Fieberbrunn. And the town is very divided, you'll be interested to know. Half the people associated with the book circle think this should be just ignored, pushed into the recesses, and the other half say, absolutely not, we need to know about our past.
Well, first of all, we're a couple of minutes away from opening up to some questions. If you all have questions, you could feel free to use the Q&A function and to send them my way. But two things. First of all, as someone who is truly blessed to love what he does in his life, I can see in you how much you come alive when you talk about the quest to get to the core of the matter in issues like this, in histories like this, in stories like this. And I'm sure when it comes to issues of justice in front of a judge in a courtroom and a jury, and to me that is really special, to find somebody who has found what he loves the most and has contributed so much through it to the world. And I kudos to you for
thank you. But
bringing that love to the world.
Can I just say something about that? When we've talked, I've come to know you well over the years, Gideon. It's been a real pleasure to have these interactions. And so there's a high level of comfort, but there's a very serious project here. I mean, I've written these books for a particular reason, and that is that I'm deeply worried about the state of various countries, the state of the world. I'm deeply worried about terrible crimes that continue. And I want really to do 2 things with these books. I mean, people need stories, but people also need to understand that the protection of human beings is an important thing. And the ideas that we've been talking about are at risk. And secondly, that ordinary folk do terrible things. And one of the things I think we need to understand is why that happens. I never describe Hans Frank or Otto Wächter or their wives as monsters, because that's too simple. They're not monsters. They're human beings who did monstrous, unspeakably awful things. But they were also capable of love and humanity and decency and generosity. And that is the challenge. We all know people who are decent people. And I think each of us has to ask the question, could I do that? If I put my hand on my heart, are there circumstances in which I would do terrible things? Or if my father murdered 500,000 people, how would I feel about my father? So we've told stories but there is a purpose here, and it is to bring to a bigger audience the fundamental importance of the rule of law, the fundamental importance of dignity, and the fundamental importance of what Nicholas Frank calls civil courage. When you reach a crossroads, and we've all reached crossroads, how do we make sure we do the right thing when we go one way or another way? And this is very difficult because each of us understands we love our families, we love our friends. What if we're threatened? What if we're under challenge? What are we going to do? And those are the issues I wanted to tease out. And those are mightily important issues.
You certainly have succeeded. And for me, again, I encourage people to watch the documentary. Please remind me of the proper title once more.
You can find it on Amazon and
Apple TV is where I found it.
Yeah, it's called My Nazi Legacy: What Our Fathers Did. It's my relationship with Nicholas and Horst. Horst, of course, thinks the title is all wrong. He does have a sense of humor, and he says the title should be What Our Fathers Did and Did Not Do.
Right.
He maintains the innocence of his father completely misguidedly. But
but that is at the end of the book. That is really where, because Horst's consistent narrative is that, well, of course my father's name might have been on these declarations because he was in charge, but he didn't really believe in it. He didn't sanction it, and he certainly wasn't there doing it with his own presence and his own eyes and his own hands and so forth. And then you manage to uncover, I'll just show one of them, these damning photos of, you can set the scene as I'm pulling up the file.
Yeah. I mean, Horst says there's no proof of anything. If you can leave this picture on, it's a dreadful picture. Horst says there's no proof. One of the letters in the files, December 1939, Otto is now in Krakow. He's the governor of Krakow, and he writes to Charlotte and says, "My darling, it's wonderful here. The Vienna Philharmonic has been, the famous people have been, I'm doing very well. A little bit of local difficulty. Tomorrow I have to have 50 people shot." So you see a line like that in a letter. I had a wonderful Polish graduate student, and I said, was there an act of mass killing in December 1939 in Poland? We researched it and we found what had happened. A town called Bochnia, Bochnia, 2 German officers had been killed by Polish resistance. And Hitler personally orders 25 Poles to be killed for each German killed. So they round up, in fact, 55 Poles. Here you can see half of the group. And Otto Wächter is entrusted with that act of killing. I don't know if you can zoom in, but this is a group of young men. Look at the faces, look at those. I mean, it's a shocking photograph. A minute before they are executed under the direct supervision of Otto Wächter. Now, that was a war crime. Reprisals are prohibited under international law. It's well documented. It is still commemorated to this day in Bochnia. And
I'm going to pull up the second photo.
Yeah.
Because the second photo is the evidence.
Well, the second photo is, there are other photos. In the book, there are 3. In fact, there are 25, 30 photos. The photos are appalling. But this is, the team lining up after the act of execution. And there, right in the middle, in the shiny black coat, is Otto Wächter, and he is the leader of the group, and he has traveled to Bochnia to personally oversee the reprisal killing of 55 Polish boys and young men, completely picked at random, a war crime, absolute slam dunk evidence of criminal wrongdoing of the highest level. And of course, it went on and on for the next 5 years.
And so you stand in the film at the field where your relatives were buried.
Yeah, I mean, it's very personal. It's very personal. My grandfather left behind, when he left Lviv in 1914, he left behind a family of about 80 people. None of them survived. They were all killed under Wächter's watch. So it's a very personal story for me. And we go to Żółkiew, and I find the mass grave, and there are 3,500 people in the mass grave, including my grandfather's family and the family of Lauterbach, commingled, still today in an essentially unmarked, unrecognized grave. It's absolutely shocking. I was there a month ago, and for the first time, there's a new mayor, and the mayor agreed to meet with me. And I said, you've got to do something about this. You have got to mark what has happened in your town. And so we are at the beginning now of a conversation about marking the event, not just at the place where it happened, but in the literature about the town, and having a marker in the town and a pointer to the mass grave so that people know what happened. Now, this is all delicate stuff because there were very few Germans in occupation there. The willing executioners were Ukrainian auxiliary police, and they came from the town, which means the descendants of the executioners are residents of the town today. So this is enormously delicate stuff. And obviously, you know, you come in and you talk and you're respectful and courteous. The children and the grandchildren have no responsibility for what their forebears did, but they do have a responsibility to engage with history and the facts, and not just to push it under the carpet. I mean, you're dealing with this now in Canada, you know, in the context of British colonial rule, where I get regular correspondence, you know, the mistreatment and the killing of children in terrible circumstances. This is beginning to emerge. And one of the things that I always say when I'm talking in Germany or Austria, you know, is I haven't come to lecture you on the horrors of your countries or Nazism or whatever. Of course, they are appalling things. Every country has trouble dealing with its past. Britain has not dealt with its colonial past, with enslavement, with racism. And this is a broader issue. And I think it's one of the reasons the books have resonated in places that you would not expect them to resonate. And that message touches a lot of people.
Well, one of the most powerful axioms in our tradition, as you know, is tzedek tirdof, justice shall you pursue, and to me, you exemplify that, and I thank you for sharing this with us tonight. And I encourage everyone to read both of these books, to read East West Street and to read The Ratline. And as I said to you earlier, this one is signed. This one's not. You have to come to Montreal to remedy that.
Don't you want to tell people a little more?
Well,
aren't you leaving out a bit of the story, Gideon?
The last thing we'll have to share before we go to the Honorable Justice Cassier is that
the call Philippe, that I made to you. I contacted you out of the blue. No,
you contacted me out of the blue and came to see me at Shaar Hashomayim, and I had no idea why. And truth be told, it was our common I don't even know our muse in many ways, Leonard Cohen, who makes his way into East West Street, makes his way into the Ratline in a much more subtle way, but I picked it out very quickly. And God willing, you will be able to be a part of our future cultural offerings at Shaar Hashomayim with a program that you have put together, a theatrical and musical program that you have put together about the Nuremberg trials. And I really hope that we can make that happen, because it will be a special evening that our community deserves to see and hear.
Well, it's a performance of East West Street. It's the story of East West Street through the music. I love music, and I admire your work so very much, Gideon, that I did reach out to you, and we've become friends through that. And we've done the performance. We have done it in the States. We've never been to Canada. I do it with a world famous opera singer, a world famous German actor.
Jewish opera singer.
Yeah, Laurent Naouri. For those of you who are opera fans, you may know Laurent Naouri. You will certainly know his wife, Nathalie Dessay, the soprano, and Nathalie, Laurent, and I, and Katja Riemann, and the pianist Guillaume de Chassis. In fact, we're doing it. If any of you are in Frankfurt on the 16th of, we only do it twice a year, but the 16th of January in Frankfurt at the Alte Oper. We're doing it in German, but we want in 2023 to do it in your synagogue.
We'll do it. We'll do it.
That's the plan.
Philippe, thank you. I turn you over to the capable hands of the justice.
Well, hello, everyone. My name's Nicholas Kassirer, and I have the happy task of thanking Professor Philippe Sands on behalf of the audience tonight at the Shaar. I speak to you from behind the main courtroom of the Supreme Court of Canada in Ottawa to convey our profound gratitude to him and to Cantor Gideon Zelermyer, also to Louis Daubrin and the organizing committee for this superb Tuesday night of learning. We've been spellbound, Philippe and Gideon, and this audience prides itself in not being a pushover. Nous vous remercions tous les deux du fond du cœur. As we've all benefited from this evening, the fact that Philippe Sands, a scholar, a teacher, plainly a storyteller, advocate, activist, is alive to the performance dimension of his work, something that he shares with Gideon Zelermyer, whose gift as a communicator plainly extends beyond illuminating liturgy and song. Philippe, your sense of the dramatic potential of your work came to me most clearly in the prologue of your best-selling East-West Street, which I commend to all viewers in the strongest possible terms if you have not read the book yet. At the start of the prologue, you describe the moment when in 1946, Hitler's personal lawyer, who you alluded to tonight, Hans Frank, entered the defendant's dock at the Nuremberg Palace of Justice to receive a sentence on charges of crimes against humanity or genocide. Therein lies part of your story. Professor Sands then depicts a subsequent moment, very dramatically, 68 years later, when he visited the same courtroom in the company of Hans Frank's son. The drama of place and of family connections, we've heard that tonight, the project Sands and Frank share of trying to make sense of an incomprehensible time in their respective histories. These are deep themes of East-West Street. The Sands-Frank encounter is described early on page 3. You'll buy the book and you won't put it down thereafter. We've heard tonight, as we've heard tonight, Ratline is full of the same kind of drama. The telling of the story of a Nazi criminal comes close in Philippe's hands to matching the story itself, telling and the story. You've got a grip on the reader, Philippe. I'm lucky as a jurist to be familiar with your scholarly work in law, which, like the Ratline and East-West Street, reflect deep learning, a profound commitment to painstaking original research in very far-flung archives, as we've learned this evening. Recently, on separate occasions, I've spoken to a French judge of an international tribunal about Maître Sands' advocacy skills, and to Philippe, one of your former graduate students in Canada, about how you excelled as a law teacher. Both have reported that Philippe brings the same high drama that we've witnessed tonight to the courtroom and to the classroom. And I would add that in your moments of leisure, Philippe, you are the honorary president of English PEN, one of the world's oldest human rights organizations, defending the right to read and to write free of oppression. In thanking Philippe Sands, I'm mindful that Montrealers have been lucky enough to hear him at least 3 times in recent past. Many of us saw him speak brilliantly with piano accompaniment at the Jewish Public Library 3 years ago, and later when he gave a lecture in international law at the Faculty of Law at McGill. Philippe is equally at ease in French and English language cultures, profoundly cosmopolitan, as we've seen tonight. And my memory is you had an apparent taste for cold weather. You seem like something of a natural for Montreal. Gideon, I would encourage this connection. And I stand as a representative of your grateful public tonight, Philippe, to say that Montreal is ready to adopt you on a long-term basis, to supply you with winter boots, what we call locally a côte de neige, at a moment's notice. So I would ask everyone to join me in offering profound thanks to Philippe Sands and Gideon Zelermyer for a perfect Tuesday night of learning at the Shaar. Thank you all.